Thank you. The next item of business is a debate on motion 24084 in the name of Graham Simpson on the COVID-19 response and the role of local newspapers. Can I invite those members who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons, or they are in the chat box if they're remote. And I call on Graham Simpson to speak to and move the motion. Mr Simpson, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I open this debate with a heavy heart. The industry where I started my career many years ago as a raw teenager is a very different beast now. Then, and for a very good while after that, local papers were the lifeblood of a community. They were respected and feared in equal measure. And if they were doing their job properly, the people fearing them could well be politicians. I've always felt very strongly that a vibrant newspaper sector is essential for democracy and a vital part of a system which holds those in power to account. A bad headline in your local paper could be enough to finish a career, and a series of bad headlines definitely would be. I found myself on the other side of the tracks when I was elected as a councillor in 2007. Even then, my local paper carried some weight. The East Kilbride News had an office in the town. You could pop in, have a chat, give them quotes, give them tip-offs. Reporters knew the town, and there were several of them. Then things changed. Newspaper companies were up against falling sales and started to centralise. The local paper closed, reporters and subs were sent to Hamilton. From Hamilton, they moved to Glasgow. Sales have continued to fall. Advertising revenue has plummeted. Staffing numbers have been cut. Now, most members will have seen their local paper either close, amalgamate or move. We're all the losers here. For democracy to thrive, it needs checks and balances. That debate is very much live here in Scotland right now. A vibrant press is one of those checks, and we must all be prepared to be subject to the full glare of publicity, good and bad. Newspapers, in my view, do a different and usually better job at exposing things than other forms of media. If they die, so does democracy. But according to the industry magazine Press Gazette, the total net loss of local newspapers across the UK from 2005 up until August last year was 265. 33 local titles had closed since the start of 2019. Now, 2005 was considered by many to be the high watermark of print newspaper profitability in the UK. The pandemic has made a bad situation worse, but to be fair, Kate Forbes helped out by approving £3.4 million of public sector advertising in news publishing. Emergency COVID legislation granted business rates relief to tourism, retail and hospitality, but it took an amendment from Murdo Fraser to include news publishers in that. The SNP were against that move. Why? That relief and the advertising are due to end next month, and Kate Forbes has so far rejected calls to extend the relief for this vital sector.
John Mason.
I thank the member for giving way. He describes the problems facing the newspaper sector. Does he think it is recoverable? Because the tourist sector is recoverable. Can newspapers survive?
Graham Simpson.
Well, I certainly hope so, and with some help, but they do need help. So Kate Forbes has rejected calls to extend the relief, and that's the reason for this debate today. But we shouldn't be having it. Here are some facts. Despite government advertising support, regional news brands lost 35% of their advertising revenue in 2020, and it's the advertising point that Labour address in their very helpful amendment, which we will support. Revenues are expected to fall a further 18.7% in the first quarter of this year. They're only expected to recover by 12% this year if we get out of lockdown fast. The Scottish economy relies heavily on retail and hospitality, but both are severely affected by lockdown, which has a knock-on effect in advertising and marketing. Rates exemptions for both are being extended, but not news publishing, which relies on it. The advertising package agreed with the Scottish Government last April helped cover that collapse, but the commitment to continue to invest in Scottish news publishers has not been renewed. By contrast, the UK government's initial £35 million has been extended twice by £15 million and £22 million to a total of £77 million. But it's not a one-way street. There has been analysis which demonstrates the effectiveness of advertising in Scottish news brands, so supporting news publishing helps the Scottish Government to reach wide audiences, particularly the elderly and those living in areas of poor connectivity. Emergency rates relief has been extended for news publishers in Northern Ireland, and most European countries have some support in place. For example, Denmark, €24 million, Lithuania and Estonia have subsidised home delivery. France is putting in €337 million over 2 years. Small publishers are being disproportionately affected. The 150-year-old Nairnshire Telegraph was forced to stop publishing at Christmas, and the Stranraer Free Press suspended publication, although it has since restarted. A study of Scottish news publishing in May 2016 found a few things. One was the industry directly employed over 3,000 people, many highly qualified and created. It supported over 4,300 Scottish jobs and created £241 million of annual income. Digital audiences have grown considerably, while those reading actual papers have fallen off. Revenue is a real issue. What we're calling for today is something that will buy this industry some time. The Scottish Government has a short-life working group on public interest journalism. That's great if they mean it, but their rather churlish amendment suggests otherwise, and we won't support that. Members of the working group support extending non-domestic rates relief for news publishers. Scotland, presiding officer, has produced some of the finest journalists in the world, and they mostly started on local papers. So let us do what we can to maintain that tradition. I move the motion in my name.
Thank you very much, Mr Simpson. I call on Ivan McKee to open for the Scottish Government. Minister, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This debate demonstrates the continuing importance of Scotland's newspapers. Across the country, newspapers report, record and reflect life in Scotland. And an independent media is central to a strong democracy, informing readers and holding power to account. Local newspapers are particularly important. They report news that may affect us more directly than national events, championing issues and causes not necessarily covered by national newspapers, including local democracy. They're especially valuable just now in informing communities about local restrictions. The Scottish Government recognised the impact of the pandemic on the newspaper industry and acted swiftly. In May 2020, we invested £3 million in an advertising press partnership to make sure that vital information about the pandemic was available. This focused heavily on local newspapers, reflecting their relevance for people who continue to rely on newspapers for exactly this kind of information. The importance of community and of place is central to this government's agenda, and the importance of local press serving local communities is a key aspect of that. It is this advertising support that we have seen as the most effective way to direct resources into the sector. It enables more effective targeting where support is needed most, in particular towards those local newspapers which are the main focus of this debate. Since the pandemic began, ministers and officials have had an ongoing dialogue with the Scottish Newspaper Society. This has helped ensure that our advertising investment is targeted where it can be most effective. We have not yet made any decisions about our approach to press advertising in the next financial year, but we will continue to engage with the SNS and others, including the National Union of Journalists, who have recently made known their perspective on this issue. But we must also recognise that printed newspapers are no longer the primary source of news for many people, particularly for younger people. The newspaper industry has been facing severe challenges for a number of years. In particular, the availability of online content, often for free, means that many people now turn to the internet as their first source of news and information. This trend towards digitisation is one that is prevalent across society and has accelerated as a consequence of the pandemic. In this, as in many other aspects of our life, it offers great opportunities as well as challenges. Newspapers themselves seek to take advantage of the opportunities as they publish online in addition to printed copy and seek new ways to engage with their readers through digital means. These factors have led to declines in newspaper circulation and advertising revenue. It's difficult to monetise online content, especially where people have come to expect access to content without paying for it. We can access information from virtually any source on any topic at the click of a mouse. There is also a trend towards hyper-local online news platforms that reflect the interests of local communities in a way that is not always possible through local newspapers. These are long-term trends that have been accelerated by the pandemic, both directly and indirectly. In the past few years, several newspapers, including a number of local titles, have closed permanently and jobs have been lost. There are also broader issues that must be considered if the newspaper industry is to reverse recent downward trends. The impact of tech giants like Google and Facebook must be considered, particularly in how they use content produced by newspapers. We must think about how we can support people, especially young people, to be informed and critical readers so they can weigh and evaluate the quality of information they are getting from various sources. One way to address these challenges is to support public interest journalism, however it is delivered. The Cabinet Secretary for Economy, Fair Work and Culture has established a short-life working group to consider the future of public interest journalism. It is expected to make recommendations by the end of the summer, which I hope will form the basis for sustainable public interest journalism in Scotland. This is an important debate, but it must not mask the long-term issues facing the newspaper industry. It is by addressing these challenges that we can build a thriving and sustainable newspaper sector. The Scottish Government did not support the introduction of NVR release for the newspaper industry. We believe this is a blunt tool that does not provide targeted support that need it most, including local newspapers, and potentially providing the biggest benefit to those that need it least. I also note that NUJ's calls that support only goes to those employers who are investing in their production and not making redundancies, cutting pay, curtailing frontline journalistic roles, paying executive bonuses, or blocking trade union organisation. Blanket rates relief would not meet the NUJ's criteria of protecting journalism. Presiding Officer, we are currently in the middle of our annual Scottish budget process. This process offers opposition parties and all across the chamber the opportunity to engage with the Cabinet Secretary for Finance to bring forward proposals for revenue and spend, to identify where best to allocate public funds and when priorities lie in providing support or relief from taxation for particular sectors. The budget process enables us to make those decisions taking into account all competing factors and assessing priorities across the full range of Scottish Government expenditure and revenue-raising priorities. I would encourage opposition parties to make use of that process, to bring forward their priorities, including those discussed in this debate this afternoon, so that it can be considered as part of that process. Presiding Officer, I move the amendment in my name.
Thank you very much. So that's Amendment 24084.1 moved. Yes, I suspect. You can give me your point of order.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Minister Ivan McKee has just made a contribution remotely, as he's entitled to do, but that means that none of us in this chamber, or indeed remotely, are able to intervene on him and question him on what he's saying. Could I urge the parliamentary authorities to tackle this issue, because we cannot have proper debates if we're unable to actually debate with people.
I think that's the same as in the preceding one with Mr Tompkins' speech. So, you know, no matter who it is, whichever party, it's just the way the technology is just now. I'm nodding with you, nodding in agreement with me, which is nice, Mr Simpson. We're on good terms. But I think you raise it with your business manager and then the Bureau can discuss. We've moved a long way with the technology in this time, I think you would agree. So if we can even improve it so you can intervene, even do points of order remotely, heaven forfend, then we will go down that route. I now call, I wish I hadn't said that. I now call Claire Baker to speak to and move Amendment 24084.2.
Thank you, Presiding Officer.
I'm sorry, sorry, just a minute, Ms Baker. I think I've said something. I think the term is misspoke, but we'll find out. Yes, of course, you can make points of order online because people do it all the time. And he wants to do one now. Oh, right. Mr McKee sorry, Ms Baker. You have a cup of tea. Mr Ivan McKee wants to make a point of order. Minister.
Yeah, just for the record, Presiding Officer, I would be delighted to take your interventions, of course, technology permitting. Get that on the record.
Yes, but you can't. See? So that's that. So, Ms Baker, I hope you've finished with your cup of tea, because now I call on Claire Baker to speak to move Amendment 24084.2. 5 minutes, please. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Presiding Officer. Free press is vital to democracy, and a thriving newspaper sector is an important part of that. It has a role in holding government and all those in public office to account, as well as in providing information and opinion to its readership. Recent decades have seen huge changes in how the press operates, as physical newspaper sales have fallen and online news has increased vastly. The fall in printed publications has meant that advertising spend has reduced alongside circulation figures. We've also seen the proliferation of fake news, misinformation, propaganda, and now more than ever, people are looking to trusted news sources for information they can rely on. Local newspapers are also part of our communities and our culture. Many are historically part of communities and provide local employment. News publishers help local businesses market their goods and services, and they advertise many local jobs. Our local press is among the most trusted news and information sources we have, and we must look to support it and continue to deliver for our communities, not undermine it by removing support and relief at this vital, critical point. During this pandemic, the role of our press has become even more important, as people have sought accurate and timely local information that is relevant to their community. The regional basis of restrictions has meant for many people their local press was the obvious place to turn up, find out up-to-date advice and information, whether online or in print. But we've also seen, we have also seen local media outlets in precarious financial positions as a result of coronavirus. Falling revenues and a reliance on limited financial reserves, ineligibility for government support, changes to staffing and operations, they have all impacted to put local newspapers in economically vulnerable places. In both the short and the long term, the newspaper industry faces challenges, but it cannot meet these without support. Labour supports the continuation of business rates relief for newspapers. The case was made for support last year, and the argument was won when the Scottish Government agreed to provide the relief in the same way it had to other sectors. It now needs to extend it in the same way it has for these other sectors. The Labour amendment for this debate seeks to highlight the importance of regional and local news and of innovative journalism and the benefits of supporting it, including through the investment of the Scottish Government's advertising budget. I asked the Scottish Government about its advertising spend in the papers last year and welcomed the increase in spend as a consequence of coronavirus, including through the Public Health Information Partnership. The question now is how will they sustain this throughout the remainder of this pandemic and beyond, so we can provide our newspaper sector with a level of consistent and predictable support. We have previously seen the negative impact that moving recruitment advertising out of local press and solely onto dedicated online platforms, resulting in huge losses in revenue for papers across the country. Amid the wider drop in advertising, the Scottish Government has a responsibility to ensure it continues to support such an important industry, and that it uses the full range of means of communication with the public which is available. Continuing advertising support will help protect the free press as well as protecting jobs within the industry. The online presence of many newspapers has increased dramatically since we saw the shift in resources, and they can meet the demands of both audiences. In June last year, the NUJ provided a helpful briefing on the impact of COVID-19 on the Scottish media, including in it a recovery plan for the sector. It highlights the challenges faced for our news sector in both the short and the long term, and proposes steps to take in order to secure an improved future for the industry. While this debate focuses on the immediate action the Scottish Government can and should take on business rates, we need a longer-term commitment to support and diversify the newspaper sector. This current crisis has demonstrated how important the provision of news continues to be, and the role that trusted, independent and accurate news sources play in supporting and informing our communities. We need to continue measures that support them through this difficult period. I'll now turn to the Scottish Government amendment, only to note that they are the only ones who have taken the decision to end business relief for newspapers, and they are responsible for explaining why. Last year, following pressure from opposition parties, the Government accepted the argument and applied business rates relief to newspapers in the same way it did to a number of other sectors. The recent budget statement confirmed this relief would continue for those sectors, for retail, for aviation, for hospitality and the leisure sectors, but not for newspapers. I would say instead of calling on other parties to balance the budget it is responsible for, the Scottish Government needs to explain why it's decided to only remove the relief for newspapers. Within the scale of the budget and the nature of the current crisis support, the savings from this cut are counterproductive and are putting our valued newspaper sector at risk. I move the amendment in my name.
Thank you very much. I'm a bit concerned. I don't know if I heard you move your amendment. Did you, Ms Baker, in the kerfuffle that preceded it? You did. And it's good I've got a help team. I'm getting help from the benches to the right. That's what I need this afternoon. And you're always helpful, Mr Fraser, indeed. I now call Alec Cole-Hamilton, please, to open the Liberal Democrats.
Thank you very much indeed, Deputy Presiding Officer. I'm very grateful to the Conservative Party for securing time for this incredibly important debate this afternoon. In so doing, I want to pay tribute to the invaluable contributions made by the local press in our nation, not just during the COVID-19 emergency, but for generations beforehand. During the last year, local news outlets have proved critical, not only in keeping people informed about what's going on locally and give an important local perspective on national issues, but they also provide a much-needed link among our communities at a time when tens of thousands of us have never felt so isolated and alone. To take one example of the critical work being done by local newspapers, the Edinburgh Evening News has a coronavirus tab immediately obvious as soon as you open their website and load the page. Upon clicking the link, you have access to countless articles that include vital information on things like infection rates in the Lothians, how to access vaccines locally, and even information on different types of vaccine that you may be offered and what to expect. In addition to providing key public service information like this, local newspapers have been vital in increasing access to community projects. This has allowed thousands of vulnerable people to receive help from within their local communities in a range of different ways, whether that's receiving a hot meal, groceries, or even just a friendly chat. Deputy Presiding Officer, just like the rest of us, the local news sector has had to adapt to a new way of working, a new reality, but has managed to do so while fully embracing its important role in providing important information to the communities that they serve. It is in part because of their importance in local communities that the newspaper sector plays such an important role in our democracy. A free and vibrant press is one of the most widely acknowledged hallmarks of a functioning democracy. By refusing to extend the business rates relief to newspapers for 2020 and 21, the Scottish Government is at severe risk of hindering the ability of Scotland's press sector to do its job and adapt to these constrained times. And to suggest furthermore that any subsequent plans for support will not be confirmed or finalised until August 2021 is just no good to them whatsoever. They need certainty from which to plan. Whilst the Scottish Government may not always like what the press has to say, which as parliamentarians we can all relate to from time to time, I cannot believe that they would want to reduce the role of the press as a source of information and of scrutiny. The consequences of a press facing ruin include undermining our democracy, hurting individual communities as well, and the ramifications for those communities and for our constituents if local press outlets are forced to close due to financial difficulty will be dire, and therefore the Scottish Government must rethink their strategy on this. Throughout this pandemic, Presiding Officer, local news sources have been some of the most valuable and trusted sources of information across our communities. In a world of fake news and misinformation, local press stands true. Whether it's the Galloway Gazette or the Orcadian, which turns 150 this year, local press organisations have proven themselves to be an integral part of community spirit and community life, a critical source of information. Now, I understand that both the UK and Scottish governments face a momentous task in rebuilding our economy and that difficult choices must be made. But this pandemic has taken so much from our society already. Let us not allow it to threaten one of the very tenets of our national democracy and our local communities. I therefore gladly offer the support of my party tonight. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr Colehampton. I call Patrick Harvey to open with the Green Party. Mr Harvey, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm happy to have the chance to take part in this debate, but I suppose I share the irritation that was in Graham Simpson's voice at the fact that this has had to come back to the Chamber at all. There have been some very interesting points made about the longer-term trends in relation to newspapers, and I think Ivan McKee made some points which were interesting and insightful and entirely irrelevant to the motion that we're debating today. Because the motion that we're debating today deals with an issue which Parliament already decided in May last year. In amending the coronavirus legislation, it was very clear that there was complete cross-party support in the opposition, and I think we were all aware that there were some people very sympathetic to it on the SNP backbenches as well. There was a broad support for that amendment to ensure that newspapers were not excluded from the rates relief. I don't see any evidence that the Scottish Government has conducted any kind of reaching out or consensus building in preparation for its decision now to remove newspapers from that rates relief. Ivan McKee also made various points about targeting, and this was part of Mike Russell's argument in asking Parliament to reject Murdo Fraser's amendment back in May. He talked about the danger, for example, that local newspapers wouldn't gain so much and that larger organisations would stand to gain more. He said that in England, the rates relief package applies only to local newspapers. Larger and more national organisations would do better out of the proposed scheme than local newspapers would. Now, I find this interesting because I find it frustrating that the Scottish Government, in its wider approach to non-domestic rates and the relief packages available during the pandemic, the Scottish Government hasn't chosen to target very much. It could do. It could take a much more targeted approach to the business support packages that it's making available, but it isn't. It seems only to be using that argument in relation to this one specific issue. And it does strike me as odd because the amendment in May last year, I think, is exactly the same kind of amendment that an SNP member would have moved themselves if they were in opposition and another party was in government saying, no, no, this can't be done. The motion, I would also point out, that we're debating today doesn't in fact call for a blanket, untargeted approach. It doesn't demand 100% rates relief for all newspapers. It calls on the Scottish Government to extend business rates relief to newspapers. Now, I think if the Scottish Government came forward with a targeted approach, which was specifically making sure that smaller independent titles, for example, gain the benefit that they need, that would be entirely consistent with the motion that we're debating today. So in closing, Presiding Officer, I do think that we're in a little bit of a strange situation here. It's the kind of issue that any opposition, I think, would advocate, regardless of party politics. I'll be supporting the amendment in the name of Claire Baker, and I'll be supporting the motion. I won't be supporting Ivan McKee's amendment today.
Thank you very much, Mr Harvey. Open debate, 4-minute speeches. I call Annabel Ewing to be followed by Liz Smith.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And at the outset of my brief intervention today on the debate, which is in fact entitled COVID-19 Response and the Role of Local Newspapers, I would wish to commend local newspapers in general for the important role they play in communities across Scotland. And I would wish to commend in particular the local newspapers available in my constituency of Cowdenbeath, being principally the Central Fife Times, the Dunfermline Press and Fife Today Group. In these very difficult times, I know from constituents that an important source of information about the pandemic and the local impacts of it is the local newspaper. And as the MSP for Cowdenbeath constituency, I certainly recognise that and seek to ensure that important information is copied to my local newspapers regularly. Of course, it is important to highlight
at the same time that there are many other important sources of information about the pandemic in my Cowdenbeath constituency, being the Scottish Government website and daily briefings, NHS 5, Fife Council, the Fife Chamber of Commerce and local third sector and voluntary groups. These go-to information sites now form part of the panoply of people's lives on a daily basis, and I believe that that is a good thing, as we surely all want people to be as informed as possible about COVID-19 and the impacts of the pandemic. And in that regard, of course, a key focal point over the last weeks has been the rollout of the vaccination, and I am sure that the news today will be welcomed by all that as of 8:30 a.m. today, 985,569 people had received their first dose of the vaccine. Turning from the role of local newspapers in helping with information dissemination during the pandemic to the issue of funding support, I am indeed pleased to note the range of business support that the Scottish Government has provided to the Scottish newspaper industry during the pandemic, and this includes the £3 million investment through increased advertising already mentioned, with an additional £400,000 having been made available to some 79 local titles across the country. The support also, as already mentioned, has included 100% rates relief and the establishment of a short life working group to consider how best to support public interest journalism, which I understand is to report in the summer. As far as the next financial year is concerned, there are several issues, of course, to bear in mind. First, there is currently a budget process underway, and I would have thought it might be more appropriate for the other parties to engage in that negotiation process in terms of their tax and spend proposals. Second, the UK Tory government's decision to delay the UK budget has, of course, made the setting of the 2021-22 Scottish budget much more difficult, as it has resulted in the Scottish Government having to proceed without crucial information on tax rates and funding. Third, as far as the UK budget is concerned, the Scottish Government Finance Secretary has already called on the UK Chancellor to guarantee further support for business impacted by the pandemic. Fourth, the Scottish Government Finance Secretary has also called for additional flexibility for the Scottish Government so we in Scotland can mobilise funding when it is most urgently needed. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, if the other parties are serious about calls for more funding to be available for any particular matter, they surely must have to have regard to the other side of the balance sheet. And they must also surely have to have regard to what they would take out from spend proposals to insert whatever their particular ask is. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. I call Liz Smith to be followed by Colin Smith.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. And can I begin my own contribution by paying tribute to the local newspapers in Mid-Scotland and Fife, the area I represent, but also to those right across Scotland, because I think during this pandemic, they have been doing the most wonderful job in keeping the public informed. It's been said a couple of times during this debate that they are an important part of democracy, and that's true. But they're also a very important part of the information service provided to the public, especially in many cases for our elderly citizens who are much less likely to be using the internet and social media for their news. I think during COVID-19, many people have found their local newspaper as well as their television perhaps the only source of news that they've been receiving about what they can safely do, about what's going on in their local community, and importantly, what messages government and health authorities are telling them. And that, of course, is true also for the local newspapers that can be accessed online. My colleague Graham Simpson rightly pointed out that local newspapers have been suffering for some time. Downsizing, drops in income, including in advertising, pressures of greater centralised control, and finding staff who are willing to work in the industry in such uncertain times. Circulation is considerably down, and of course, so it is for advertising, which is not surprising, given that many of the businesses who would normally be involved in advertising in our local papers, such as hotels and restaurants and retailers, they're just not operating just now. So these are extremely difficult times in the world of local papers. Indeed, some famous titles have stopped publishing altogether, at least in the physical format, and we should be very worried about that. And of course, local newspapers are very important to ourselves. As MSPs, we rely on them to publish details of our surgeries, our press releases, take photographs of us, all kinds of events that in normal times we will attend, whether that's going to visit schools or agricultural shows or whatever it might do. And we rely on them very heavily. And they are now asking for some support. And I think we are duty bound to provide that. Now, last week, the Scottish Government announced a package of assistance for newspapers, and that's welcome, but it certainly won't go far enough to support the local papers when it's spread so thinly across every title in Scotland. As my colleague Murdo Fraser said back in May during the COVID debate, the second coronavirus Scotland bill, he asked why we should single them out. Well, I think it's fairly evident as to why we should single them out in this respect, particularly as we are asking for an extension for the period of a year of the relief on business rates. I think they are absolutely vital at this time particularly. And while it may not be the long-term solution, I think it's something that we should be charged with. And I don't really understand why the SNP are reluctant to do this, because I think it's very important. And as Patrick Harvey rightly pointed out, we agreed on this some time ago. And it's not as a huge amount of money. In fact, I think it's less than 4 million for that particular period. So I think
huge amount of money, is it? No.
I think we can do that for that short period of time. So I believe it's very important that we support our local papers, and I very much support the motion that's in the name of Graham Simpson.
Thank you very much. I call Colin Smith to be followed by John Mason. Mr Mason is the last speaker in the open debate.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Often I begin a speech by welcoming the opportunity to debate a particular issue, but on this occasion, as others have said, this is a debate we should not be having because, frankly, it should not be necessary. By announcing a 3-month extension of rates relief for sectors such as retail and hospitality, the Scottish Government has acknowledged that those sectors are struggling, but by withdrawing that same relief from newspapers, they have failed to grasp the interdependence between those sectors. Newspapers are struggling partly because retail and hospitality is struggling. Lockdown means our shops, our hotels, our restaurants, our pubs have little at present to advertise in our newspapers, and fewer people visiting our high streets due to lockdown means fewer people are picking up a paper. Therefore, if the extension of rates relief is needed for retail and hospitality, it is also absolutely needed for our newspapers, as is the continuation of advertising support, which has been so critical to supporting newspapers over the past year and so important in helping get across those key public health messages. And that's why Labour has highlighted this issue in our amendment. But, Presiding Officer, this issue runs even deeper than the financial viability of our newspapers. It's almost a year since the Economy Secretary hailed our journalists and declared them as key workers. She said, and I quote, "In these challenging circumstances, having access to reliable information is a key part of a functioning society and public confidence. The news publishing sector plays a vital role in this." Yet, 12 months on, the decisions of this government risk turning many of those key workers into non-workers. In fact, research group Enders Analysis estimates that the revenue crunch facing newspapers puts a third of UK journalism jobs at risk. Our newspapers already faced challenging times before the pandemic. In the words of the National Union of Journalists, the COVID-19 crisis has hit an industry with underlying health conditions. The Cairn Cross Review in 2019 reported that the number of full-time frontline journalists working in the UK had fallen from 23,000 in 2007 to 17,000, while newspaper annual advertising spend had already dropped by 69%, that's £3.2 billion, and annual circulation revenue by 23%, that's £500 million. It led, even before the pandemic, to drastic cost-cutting. Few of our local titles are now printed locally, and given the shedding of jobs, the small teams in many of our local papers really are performing miracles to keep stories flowing week in, week out. Sadly, many titles, however, have not been able to keep going in recent years, and others have been on the brink of printing their final edition altogether, such as the Estill and Liddlesdale Advertiser in my own region, which just a few years ago was saved from closure by the local community, who stepped in to keep the printing presses running, not just because of the Advertiser's 168-year history, but because of its important role serving the local community right now. As we've already heard, during the pandemic, some titles also stopped printing for a period during the first lockdown, such as the Stranraer and Wigton Free Press, but have been able to fight back and are now up and running, delivering for the local community. And, Presiding Officer, the pandemic really has brought home to us all how important that role is, not just in keeping readers up to date with stories affecting their lives and their community, but providing a reliable and trusted source of information. At a time when verified and factual public health advice has never been more essential, and in the face of the plague of misinformation we see every day on social media, the trusted journalism from our local newspapers is absolutely crucial. So, Presiding Officer, the decision by the Scottish Government to extend rates relief for other sectors into the next financial year, but axe that relief for newspapers at the same time and pull back on advertising, really is a case of trying to undermine that role and kicking a sector when it's done. We can't wait for working groups to report. That decision will mean job losses in weeks and ultimately a loss of unbiased local news, fueling the rise of online fake news. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, I know the Government opposed the extension of rates relief to newspapers last year, but this Parliament voted to amend the coronavirus bill to deliver that relief. So if Parliament votes for this motion, and Labour's amendment today, I hope the Government will respect that decision, respect the will of Parliament and continue that rates relief given our newspaper sector the support it needs in these difficult times.
Thank you very much. I now call John Mason. Mr Mason.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And can I start off by agreeing with Graham Simpson that we should be able to have interventions during these hybrid debates. Newspapers have been facing a challenging time for a number of years, with circulation falling and more people getting their news in other ways. And I confess I have been quite traditional when it comes to newspapers and persisted in buying printed copies of the Herald and the Evening Times right through until COVID started. I like the fact that you get a summary of the day's news in one place, and one advantage of a newspaper is that you get to decide what you're reading and what you're skipping, whereas with TV and radio, it's the broadcaster who decides how long we spend on each topic. But with COVID and the encouragement to stay at home, and only to shop when necessary, I personally switched to subscribing to the Herald and Glasgow Times, as it is now called, online, and I have to say that has been working well for me. I have to say I'm slightly put off by my whip and the Deputy Presiding Officer. Sorry. As has been said, newspapers have been struggling for quite some time, and that has been made worse by COVID, with people being discouraged from a daily visit to the shops to get a paper. Assuming the Herald is a national newspaper and the Glasgow Times is regional, perhaps serving some 15 constituencies in and around Glasgow, my constituency has no local newspaper. We used to have a couple, but they died out some years ago. Why did that happen? Presumably because in a less affluent area, there just has not been sufficient advertising revenue to go round. Now, I am not arguing that only richer areas have local newspapers. The neighbouring constituency to mine is Rutherglen, where I grew up, and is quite a mixed area, and they still have the Rutherglen Reformer. And I would dearly love to see a paper like that in the East End of Glasgow. But it does mean that in Glasgow-Shettleston constituency, we do not get news of local schools, churches, scouts or guides, and even local politicians, which is what I was used to when I was younger, and which clearly some other areas still get. We need to go looking for such local news on websites or social media, and I do think this is a real loss for the community when we do not have a local newspaper. But the economics have shifted over time, and just as so much shopping has shifted online, so has the availability of local information. I certainly would not oppose support for local newspapers if the money can be found, and I would really rather see them expanding than contracting. However, let's remember that any such support will not help the people in a less well-off constituency, such as mine, with no newspapers. I would like to also make some general points about the budget. If the Conservatives are looking for specific changes to the draft budget, then I'm certain that Kate Forbes will be happy to discuss that with them. However, it would be useful to know whether the Conservatives are really serious about negotiating for funding for local newspapers. If this was agreed, would they then support an amended Scottish Government budget? Or are they going to produce a long list of contradictory requests, as normally happens, and then still oppose the budget no matter what? Their usual mantra is that they want taxes cut and spending raised, but sorry, that does not add up. Are we going to see more realistic and financially literate proposals from the Conservatives this year? The 21-22 budget has clearly been made more complex because of COVID, and that was unavoidable. But it has also been made more difficult for all of us in this Parliament by the totally avoidable delay in the Westminster budget. It did not need to be delayed until 3rd March, but because it has been, Kate Forbes, the Finance Committee and all the rest of us have been left very much in the dark as to what we have to spend, both on non-COVID and on COVID-related expenditure. So in summary, I would want to be supportive of local newspapers, but let's have a more realistic approach to the budget from the Conservatives. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now call Ian Gray to close for Labour. Mr Gray, please.
Thank you very much. It's been a very short but interesting debate. Graham Simpson opened it by saying how he remembered when local papers were the lifeblood of their local community. And he painted, I thought, quite a bleak picture of the current day circumstances. So bleak, in fact, that John Mason was provoked to intervene and ask if local newspapers are recoverable in a rather apocalyptic intervention. Well, what I want to say is that in many parts of Scotland, local papers still are the lifeblood of our communities. In East Lothian, we continue to be served every week, it will be tomorrow, by the award-winning East Lothian Courier, as we have been since 1859. Colin Smith told us about another local paper very close to my heart, the Stranraer Free Press, who fought back from going only digital and are now publishing again. And Alex Cole-Hamilton talked about the important role the Edinburgh Evening News has been playing over COVID. And that is an important point. Important as they are at any time in our communities, at a time like this, these local papers have been absolutely critical. A year or so ago, when the first lockdown happened, we spent a lot of time in here praising the local resilience groups and community support groups, volunteer groups who sprung up in all of our towns and villages. Well, I have to say that in East Lothian, the local paper, the East Lothian Courier, was critical in allowing these groups to do their work. Every week they gave over 1 or 2 pages to report on everything that they were doing, the services that they operated, how they could be contacted, and of course that was particularly useful for older citizens who perhaps aren't online. But it wasn't just those special things which were so important at that time. The Courier and other local papers continue to do what they do week in, week out, yet more so. Sadly, the local death notices became a very important part of letting people understand and know what was happening when tragically so many of our fellow citizens were losing their life to COVID. They cover and promote local fundraising efforts, many of which sprung up in order to support work that was being done, the purchase of PPE, the manufacture of PPE even, all of that was promoted by the local paper. And of course they also, as they do every week, continue to support local businesses in the darkest of times for many of them, even allowing people to know, for example, which restaurants were continuing to do takeaway or shops doing click and collect. So they have been critical. And I thought the Minister's contribution was really pretty disingenuous to talk about the importance of local papers, as Ivan McKee did, and to then challenge opposition parties, to reduce that to a party political challenge to opposition parties to save local papers by changing the government's budget. It's just fatuous. And equally fatuous, I have to say, is to point to the Scottish Government Working Group on the Press, as Annabel Ewan did, because the members of that group today have publicly called for a reversal of this decision. Patrick Harvey, I think, had some justification in wondering what the Scottish Government's got against local papers. Why do they single them out for this lack of support? And they've got form on this. 2010, they tried to take away the requirement to place public notices in local papers. The opposition had to get them to change their mind. A year ago, they excluded papers from rate relief. The opposition had to make them change their mind. So they had to think again 10 years ago. They had to think again 1 year ago. They need to think again tonight.
Thank you very much. I now call Jamie Hepburn to close for the Scottish Government. Minister, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer, and can I also thank Graham Simpson for bringing forward today's debate. I think it is a sector that is worth us focusing on in this chamber. I take issue with the point that Ian Gray has just made. This government does not have anything against the newspaper sector. I firmly believe, and I concur entirely with the sentiment that has been expressed by various members that a foundation of any free society must be a free press. And the idea this government has something against newspapers in this country is, I'm afraid to say, fatuous. And of course, I'll give way.
Ian Gray.
Can you understand that if we simply look at local newspapers as local businesses, the fact that they have been specifically excluded from support extended to other businesses must make them feel as if the government has something in for them?
Minister.
Well, I would observe that there are many sectors that haven't had that support extended to them, because frankly we cannot extend that form of support to every single business in the country. But I'll come to the point, because much has been made over the course of this debate that there was a vote through the coronavirus legislation to extend rates relief to the newspaper sector. I accept that. And this government has adhered to that vote. That vote, of course, put in place that relief for this financial year. We've adhered to that. Now, unless members are going to say that that vote stands for time immemorial, then surely we have to look at the process that we are presently engaged in. And we do this on an annual basis. This shouldn't be a surprise to any member of this chamber. There could be a question, maybe this is just me being cynical as to how genuinely others engage in the process of dialogue around the Scottish budget. But we have an annual process of setting the budget. And frankly, we are not doing anything inconsistent here. As other members made the point at the time of that debate around the legislation, the government articulated its own position in respect of non-domestic rates for the newspaper sector. We continue to hold to that position because, yes, I understand the argument. It's entirely legitimate for the argument to be advanced and articulated by opposition members in here. But we also have to think about how we use public finances most effectively and get best value for that investment. And of course, I'll give way to Mr Simpson.
Graeme Simpson.
I'm grateful to the Minister, but the Government has agreed to extend business rates relief for other sectors, but not the newspaper sector, which this Parliament voted for. Why is that? It does look as though you've got something against the sector. Minister.
Well, first of all, I hope he appreciates the opportunity to intervene. I know he thinks that's particularly important. I was glad to facilitate that opportunity. I would go back to the point, we do not have anything against the newspaper sector, but that was our position at the time of that debate. We accepted that the perspective of Parliament in terms of that legislation was for this financial year. That's a sector that should have had that support extended to it. But we are consistent in our position as we approach this budget. And I'm afraid to say it is not fatuous, as Mr Gray put it, to say that this should be part of the process of budget dialogue. Of course it should be part of the process of budget dialogue. If this is a priority for other... Mr Gray says there's no dialogue. He says there's no dialogue. Every year, this government seeks to facilitate dialogue.
Excuse me a minute, Minister, sit down. There's a dialogue going on here that shouldn't be going on. You speak through the chair, Mr Gray. You know that. Minister.
And I hope it was accepted, Presiding Officer. I was speaking through the chair, but I could hear the utterances.
Beg your pardon, it was Mr Gray who was not speaking through the chair. There was a dialogue between the two of you, as if the rest of us were on another planet. That's not appropriate. Well, continue.
I do apologise, Presiding Officer. I did say Mr Gray had uttered from the sidelines. I couldn't help but hear. He suggests there is no dialogue on the budget. There is the opportunity for dialogue each and every year. And if this is a priority for other parties, then they are welcome to advance that perspective as part of that discourse. But we do take the need to support our newspaper sector seriously. And I do regret that Patrick Harvey felt that the points that were advanced by Ivan McKay around long-term sustainability for the sector were somehow irrelevant to today's debate. Mr Simpson himself accepts their relevance because he talked, and I agreed with him, about the position, the long-term challenges that the sector has faced. And it is appropriate that we raise that today because we do know, yes, of course, the pandemic has had an impact and we've sought to respond. We've sought to leverage our advertising budget to support that sector. That's something we've done over the past period. It was appropriate for us to do that. But we do have to consider the sector in the round. And the trends that we've seen in newspapers have been in place for some time. COVID-19 has, of course, exacerbated them, but we've stepped up to support them. But we do need to consider how we support the sector in the longer term. Rates relief is not a long-term solution in of itself, and that's why I think the work of the Working Group on Public Interest Journalism should not be dismissed. It is important, and as members have mentioned, it contains the relevant people to take forward that discourse. We are serious in our intent to support newspapers, but we do have concerns that non-domestic rates relief is not the most efficient or cost-effective way to respond to those long-term challenges facing the newspaper industry. So I urge members to support our amendment today. I think it's entirely legitimate and appropriate that we urge others to come forward with a proposition as part of the coherent response to the budget process. I can see I'm getting the thumbs down from the Conservative benches. That might indicate just how seriously, once again, they take the budget process this year.
Thank you very much. I now call Maurice Golden to close for the Conservatives. Mr Golden, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Graham Simpson remarked, if newspapers die, democracy dies, in a wonderful speech. And Alex Cole-Hamilton followed up that theme and talked of a free and vibrant press being the hallmark of a functioning democracy. Ivan McKee spoke about the importance of local communities and highlighted the advertising support provided by the Scottish Government, very welcome, along with that of the UK Government. Claire Baker spoke of a trusted and independent and accurate news being absolutely essential, and I wholeheartedly agree. And there have been a lot of numbers flying around in today's debate, but one number in particular stands out: 3,000. That is the number of people directly employed by the newspaper industry in Scotland. That is the number of people who face a direct threat to their jobs. That is the number of people who will be worried about how they will support themselves and their families. And all because this SNP government plans to cut off support when it is needed most. This could signal the death knell for the sector. And this is regardless of the value of these papers, especially the local ones, provide to their communities. This point was highlighted by my colleague Liz Smith. Notable examples of journalism excellence include the Press and Journal and the Courier. My school playground was overlooked by DC Thompson's offices, although I'm glad to say the Bash Street kids predate me. I'm not sure which character I would have ended up. Or the Clydebank Post, which is at the forefront of providing cutting-edge local news, or the Largs and Millport News, which holds the record for Britain's longest-serving editor, or at the Arran Banner, which once achieved a Guinness World Record for reaching 97% of Arran's population. These and Scotland's other local papers do more than support jobs, though. They are a vital part of our society, informing the public, holding power to account and supporting their communities. Deputy Presiding Officer, it should be a priority for this SNP government to help bring these papers back from the brink before they are lost forever. That is why the Scottish Conservatives are here today to ask that, the SNP to do the right thing, extend business rates relief for another year. I fully appreciate this is not the party's position. In fact, rates relief was only extended to newspapers at the start of the pandemic because they were forced to do so. A point well made, and I don't say this often, by Patrick Harvey. In fact, the Scottish Government's own short-life working group on public interest journalism has called for rate relief to be extended to Scottish newspapers, and this was again highlighted by Ian Gray. But there is still time to act, and it would have a minimal impact on the overall budget, costing around £4 million for the whole year. Deputy Presiding Officer, this is just the tip of the iceberg, though. Across Scotland, there are a great many individuals and businesses receiving little or no support, such as hospitality, tourism and leisure. The Scottish Hospitality Group has warned that the Strategic Framework Business Fund is not serving licensed premises very well, and they are sensibly calling for support to be focused on premises suffering the greatest impacts, regardless of the tier level they eventually return to. Deficiencies in the strategic framework support have also been highlighted by the Federation of Small Businesses. They warn small specialist retailers, such as drinks, hardware and animal specialists, are not able to apply for grants, and few, if any, will get discretionary funding. And also, others are slipping through the cracks. Bingo halls, for example, have not seen dedicated support in the same way other leisure activities have, or the animal boarding sector, obviously reeling from the massive downturn in tourism, but again with no dedicated support. Again, they're at the mercy of discretionary council funding. They did not even receive the same business rates extension as the rest of the hospitality, tourism and leisure sector, the very support currently being withdrawn from the newspaper industry. The director of the Scottish Newspaper Society could not have been clearer about the SNP's plan to withdraw support when he said, "There is no doubt this creates an immediate crisis for Scottish journalism." And crisis is the right word, because the newspaper industry in Scotland is on its knees. Advertising revenue crashed 35% last year, a catastrophe for an industry so reliant on advertising for its income. A situation not helped by the fact that much of the advertising comes from hospitality and retail businesses. And I welcome Labour's amendment today and will be supporting it at decision time. Deputy Presiding Officer, today is not about party politics. It is about saving jobs and protecting a vital part of our democracy. I am simply asking the SNP to do the right thing.
Thank you very much, Mr Golden. That concludes the debate on the COVID-19 response and the role of local newspapers. And after a short pause, we'll move on to the next item of business.
Thank you, colleagues. The next item of business is consideration of Business Motion 24102 in the name of Graham Day on behalf of the Bureau setting out a business programme. Could I call on the Minister Graham Day to move the motion?
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. No member has indicated they wish to speak on the motion. The question therefore is that motion 24102 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed, thank you. The next item is consideration of Business Motion 24103, also in the name of Graham Day on behalf of the Bureau, on a Stage 2 timetable. Could I ask the Minister to move this bill?
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. This motion, sorry. No member has indicated they wish to speak on this motion. The question therefore is that motion 24103 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. And the next item is consideration of 4 Parliamentary Bureau motions. Could I call on Graham Day on behalf of the Bureau to move motions 24106 and 24107 on approval of SSIs, 24108 on suspension of standing orders, and 24109 on variation of standing orders?
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. And the question on those motions will be put at decision time. Yes, point of order, Jackie Bailey.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I'd like to raise a point of order about the actions of special advisers. At the off-camera, on-the-record briefing, Special Adviser Stuart Nicholson was asked to clarify the First Minister's comments on compelling the attendance of Alex Salmond at the committee, and he said, and I quote, yeah, I mean yes, you surmise correctly, I mean bluntly, why wouldn't they? If the committee and all of its members are serious about getting to the facts and getting to the truth as they claim to be, then why on earth wouldn't they use the powers at their disposal to compel witnesses to attend? They've previously talked about using those powers in respect of other witnesses, so you know it would seem to make sense that they would want to do it in this case. I'm not sure that we have, Presiding Officer, but whatever the committee decide in relation to using those powers or not, with Alex Salmond, or indeed other special advisers, it is a matter for the committee, not the Scottish Government. And indeed, can I ask why special advisers have also briefed the press about the substance of WhatsApp messages obtained from the Crown Office before committee members had been provided with numbered copies in a reading room, which were then handed back. Presiding Officer, there may indeed be a breach of the Special Advisor Code of Conduct, but frankly, it is disrespectful and entirely unacceptable for the Government and Special Advisors in particular to dictate to committees of this Parliament.
Thank you very much, Ms Bailey, and thanks. I did get some advance notice, short notice of the point of order. It strikes me, though, that although I can understand why Ms Bailey is concerned, it's a matter for the committee. It's not a matter for me. It's not a procedural matter for me to rule in this chamber. I would advise Ms Bailey to bring it up at our committee, of which she's a member. We're going to turn now to decision time. And now the first question this evening is that Amendment 24095.2 in the name of the Lord Advocate, which seeks to amend motion 24095 in the name of Murdo Fraser on the Crown Office, be agreed. Are we all agreed? No. We're not agreed. So we're going to move to a division, and I'm going to suspend Parliament shortly, just for a few moments, to allow members to access the voting app. So Parliament is suspended for a few moments. Thank you, colleagues. We are now back in session and we're going to go straight to the vote. So the question is that Amendment 24095.2 in the name of the Lord Advocate, which seeks to amend motion 24095 in the name of Murdo Fraser on the Crown Office, be agreed. Members may cast their votes now. This will be a 1-minute division. That vote is now closed. If members were not able to exercise their vote or had difficulty, please let me know through a point of order. Can I call Margaret Mitchell to make a point of order? Margaret Mitchell.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I was not able to vote. I would have voted no.
Thank you, Ms Mitchell. I will note that. I will make sure your vote is added. You would have voted no to the amendment in the name of the Lord Advocate. Can I call Finlay Carson to make a point of order? Finlay Carson.
Presiding Officer, I was unable to access the app. I would have voted no.
Thank you, Mr Carson. I'll make sure your vote is added. You would have voted no to the amendment in the name of the Lord Advocate. Thank you for letting me know. And can I call Alexander Burnett to make a point of order?
Apologies, Presiding Officer. I don't know what's happening with my device. I would have voted no.
Thank you, Mr Burnett. I'll also make sure your vote is added. You would have voted no on the amendment. Thank you. Sorry, could I call Rachel Hamilton to make a point of order? Rachel Hamilton.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I would have voted no.
Thank you, Ms Hamilton. I'll make sure that vote is also added to the register. Thank you. Thank you, colleagues. The result of the vote on amendment number 24095.2 in the name of the Lord Advocate is yes 66, no 59. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore agreed. The next question is that amendment 24095.1 in the name of Rhoda Grant, which seeks to amend the motion in the name of Murdo Fraser, be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. And the next question is that motion 24095 in the name of Murdo Fraser as amended on the Crown Office be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Before our next question, I would just remind members that if the amendment in the name of Ivan McKee is agreed, then the amendment in the name of Claire Baker will fall. So the question is that Amendment 24084.1 in the name of Ivan McKee, which seeks to amend Motion 24084 in the name of Graham Simpson on the COVID-19 response and the role of local newspapers, be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. No, we're not agreed. We'll move to a division and members may cast their votes now. This is a vote on the amendment in the name of Ivan McKee, 24084.1. Members have 1 minute. That vote is now closed. I would encourage any member who was not able to vote to let me know, and I call Liam MacArthur to make a point of order. Liam MacArthur.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I was unable to log in there for some reason and voted no.
Thanks, Mr MacArthur. I'll make sure your vote no is added to the register. And can I call Finlay Carson to make a point of order? Finlay Carson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Unable to vote. I would have voted no to that amendment.
Thank you, Mr Carson. I will also make sure that your vote no is added. That's 2 noes against the amendment in the name of Ivan McKee. Thank you, colleagues. The result of the vote. Thank you, colleagues. The result of the vote on amendment number 24084.1 in the name of Ivan McKee is yes 62, no 63. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. The next question is that Amendment 24084.2 in the name of Claire Baker, which seeks to amend the motion in the name of Graham Simpson, be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. And the next question is that motion 24084 in the name of Graham Simpson, as amended, on the COVID-19 response and the role of local newspapers. Sorry, not as amended. Yes, as amended. It was amended by Claire Baker. Make sure you keep yourself straight. The next question is that motion 24084 in the name of Graham Simpson as amended on the COVID-19 response and the role of local newspapers be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Now I propose to ask a single question on 4 parliamentary bureau motions. Does any member object? No. The final question is that motions 24106 and 24107 on approval of SSIs, 24108 on suspension of standing orders and 24109 on variation of standing orders, all in the name of Graham Day on behalf of the Bureau, be agreed. Are we agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Thank you very much. That concludes decision time. And before we go, just remind members to wear your masks, follow the one-way systems, observe social distancing, and I close this meeting. Thank you.